Hello, my name is Peter Linford. In this video, I'd like to provide you with some insights on the roles and responsibilities of being a diplomat with the Australian government. A diplomat is defined as a representative of government, but there are a very diverse range of roles as a diplomat, depending on which country you may be posted to, how big the mission it is that you're joining, which Australian department you're representing, and of course what your level of position is within that department. There are numerous agencies from Australia that send people overseas as diplomatically accredited staff. These include the Australian Federal Police, ASIS and ASIO covering the policing and security roles, the Department of Defence, Treasury, Department of Agriculture, Department of Innovation, Department of Education, to name a few. The principal agency that sends people overseas is the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, also known as DFAT. DFAT have the prime responsibility of government-to-government relations, and they also cover the critical role of consular operations, which provides services and supports to Australians who are living, working and travelling overseas. The other agency I'll give you some insights to is the agency that I work for, the Australian Trade Commission, also known as Austrade. I had 4 postings with the Australian Trade Commission from 1997 through to 2012, the first being in Japan, followed by Korea, followed by the United Arab Emirates covering the Middle East, and finally in India covering South Asia. To join these agencies, there are a range of ways to be recruited. Probably the most predominant is through a graduate recruitment program, and certainly that's a prime vehicle into entering into DFAT. DFAT run promotional presentations at leading universities, and we'll do that in Monash University where you're studying. They also have cross postings, and they have people come from other departments and externals, but they're more an exception than the rule, and most people come as graduates. They join as Australian public servants. Remember, a diplomat is someone who is a diplomat only when they're in posting. Otherwise, they are always a public servant of the Australian government. So you would work in Canberra as a recruit. You would work your way through training and levels of experience until you're ready for a posting. And then you'll be sent for a first posting of 3 years. After that posting, you'll almost certainly come back to Australia for a period of usually 3 years before you're eligible for subsequent postings. That's the pattern within DFAT. There are some exceptions, but usually it's a 1 posting off, 1 posting back. In the Australian Trade Commission, the normal rule is a maximum of 2 consecutive postings overseas, but there are exceptions. I'm obviously a case in point. All 4 of my postings were consecutive. I never worked for Australia in Australia, and in actual fact, when I finally was required to come back to Australia and take up a position in Sydney, that's when I decided it was time to retire from Australia and join the private sector, which is what I did. The thought of the administrative burden, the bureaucracy, the political correctness, and the mundane roles, which you still have when you're over at posting, because administration is important there, but I thought it would be a little bit overbearing for me, having been overseas for as long as I had, to go back to Sydney and perform that role. So I left the Australian Trade Commission, and today I work in the private sector. I live in Bahrain. I work mostly in Saudi Arabia and in India for a large Saudi-based multinational corporation. It's a very rewarding position in all aspects. But I can say hand on heart that had I not had my career with Austrade, had I not had the experiences and the diverse roles and interactions with government across different cultures at the levels that I had, I wouldn't have been positioned to get the role that I have now. So I'm forever grateful of the fond memories I have of the Australian Trade Commission and where it has taken me to. To position yourself for these roles, the type of attributes that will be highly regarded, you should have undergraduate as a minimum and postgraduate preferred. The master's course at Monash in Diplomacy and Trade is an excellent course, and within that course, international law, I would say, is a compulsory subject. I wish I'd done that course before I was set off as a diplomat. I'm doing it now as a mature age student, but the insights are very important, setting you up for the experiences and the challenges that you're going to face when you do go overseas as an Australian diplomat. Within the subject, 2 documents that you must be familiar with, the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations and the Vienna Convention on Consular Relations. They're not overly complicated documents, but they set out the roles and responsibilities of diplomats, and also the immunities, which people get excited about, the diplomatic immunities that are provided. It's true when you're overseas under diplomatic accreditation that you can't be arrested in the host country under their laws, but that country can cancel your accreditation and you can be removed and sent home without any explanation from the host country should you be involved in any type of indiscretion. More likely though, if your behaviours aren't seen as suitable, you'll be sanctioned by the Australian side at post, or you may be returned by your department to Australia, either of which are probably career-ending, damaging outcomes for you. Indiscretions may be poor behaviour, excessive alcohol consumption, especially in public. Remember, you're a representative of the Australian government, so the image that you portray is 24/7. And if you're out in public, even outside of working hours, and you don't present yourself well, then you're not presenting the Australian government well, and it can bear badly on the post, and then of course it will bear badly on you. Inappropriate personal relationships, substance abuses, even indiscretions of statements in the press, which may bring about negative image of Australia and your post and your role, can bring about unpleasant situations and can be negatively viewed upon on your position and your role. The other attributes that you should be well travelled, you should have good cultural sensitivity. Remember, what happens outside of Australia can be different, but it doesn't mean it's necessarily wrong. I currently live and work in Saudi Arabia, and the image of Saudi Arabia is, of course, not very well regarded, especially not in Australia. And some of the things here are very different to what we would accept in Australia. But remember, just because some things are different, it doesn't mean that they're wrong. And you should have cultural sensitivity. You should have an open mind and flexibility, and you will be more productive. You'll be more effective. You'll be more well regarded by the people in your country, and you'll make better friends, build better networks, and you'll have a more satisfying experience if you're able to do that. It's also important that you understand there are challenges when you go overseas in terms of loneliness, homesickness, culture shock, and this can be not only for yourself, but if you have an accompanying family with you. Your spouse may have given up a career or put a career on hold to go with you overseas into a country that is very culturally different, where they don't speak the language, and normal day-to-day activities like schools, shopping, doctors, hospitals, cars that you take for granted living in Australia all of a sudden become onerous for you when you're living overseas. And those things can put a stress on you, they can put a stress on your family, and if you're not well prepared for them and if you don't understand them, they can end up being terminating the position because the functionality and the effectiveness that you're able to deliver because of those challenges make it impossible. There are courses that you can do before you go there, and most departments will give you cultural preparation, but I highly recommend it, and not only for you as an officer, but also for your family and dependents. When you go overseas, you have a range of roles that you have to cover. One of the exciting ones is looking after visiting dignitaries, prime ministers, federal ministers, premiers, state ministers, celebrities, whether sports identities or culture or television movie identities, and of course leaders of business and commerce as well, and other parts of the community. When these people visit you in post, you have a responsibility to make their visit a success, to support their visit so that it's a success for them, but also to ensure that their presence when you're in country enhances your role, builds your image, enhances your networks and connections, and gives you an opportunity to be more successful in what you're doing. Almost without exception, the Prime Ministers I've worked with have been stunningly good. Bob Hawke was fantastic, as was John Howard. Julia Gillard overseas was sensational, and what may surprise a few people, I found Kevin Rudd also to be wonderful when he came overseas to the postings where I was at. I had the privilege on one occasion, our High Commissioner hadn't presented credentials in India, and so as a senior representative at the Commission, I was tasked with doing the official receipt of the Prime Minister when he landed in India in the Prime Minister's jet. On landing, the Prime Minister transferred to a military C-130 Hercules and flew to Afghanistan to do a short visit to our troops who were based there. I then, together with some of my diplomat colleagues, joined Mrs. Rudd, and we boarded the Prime Minister's jet, and we flew from the city of Chennai to the city of Mumbai, still in India, where we waited for the C-130 to come back, receive the Prime Minister again, and then all as a group fly from Mumbai to Delhi, where the official program then commenced. A great story for grandchildren to go on the Prime Minister's jet. I don't think in private sector there are many opportunities to do it, but as a diplomat one day you may have that, and it was certainly an exciting experience for me to both receive the Prime Minister, Mrs. Rudd, and to have the opportunity to fly on the Prime Minister's jet. Not all of our politicians, unfortunately, behave really well. We have a saying in the diplomatic corps called flag on car syndrome. You know, you start getting titles of Your Excellency, Minister, and people get lost in their own grandeur, and they get self-important, and it's in those situations that you have to manage outcomes to still get a positive image of Australia and a positive outcome for the visit itself. You have to sometimes zip your lips and hold your tongue and be patient. You know, you're a public servant. It's the Australian image that comes first and foremost. So even if you have a politician who is unreasonable, you have to grin and bear it and make the most of it. It's not always the politicians that do it. It can be the spouses of partners. I've seen some of those behave badly, even the spouses of some of the diplomats who get lost in importance. I remember an ambassador's wife who had requested a car to take her for coffee with some of her friends. When the car came around to pick her up, she sent the car away because she didn't think the make and model were sufficiently high grade to reflect her importance as the wife of the Ambassador of Australia. You know, the reality is the car is designated for the ambassador's use. And as a public servant, your spouse and partners, you have to buy your own car and pay for that. So she actually wasn't entitled to a car. And there's a clear example, excuse the pun, for flag on car ego syndrome. But it happens, and you just have to deal with it. And for the most part, I think Australians by nature and personality, are very gracious in these roles, but they can get tied up in their self-importance. One of the other major functions that you're going to have is consular operations, and this is taking care of Australians who get into trouble overseas, whether by their own doing or by accident. It can be hospitalisations or deaths, it can be arrests, legalities, it can be natural disasters. I was in Japan when the Kansai earthquake hit in Osaka. I was in Dubai when the second invasion into Iraq happened by the Bush-led government. I was in India when the terrorist attacks happened in the hotels in Mumbai. You have to drop all of your standard work when those situations happen. Your priority is the welfare and the well-being of Australians who are under your care. You have to find them, you have to make sure that they're okay, you have to let them know how you can help them. There's a very good website in Australian government, www.smarttraveller.gov.au. It outlines everything that an Australian mission can provide in terms of support, and also what it can't provide in terms of support. You have to get consent from Australians overseas to be able to communicate back to their family, and you'll study this in international law and make sure you do, because it's a legal consent, and so you're accountable if you contravene that information and pass that back without their consent. And sometimes a young Australian who is arrested for whatever issue overseas may not want their parents to know they're arrested while you're trying to get them out of jail. But once you have their consent, of course, it's about prompt and detailed and accurate communication back through the consular operations desk in Canberra, who will then communicate and liaise with families, and your role is the well-being and the information passing to the person, whether they're in jail or whether they're in hospital or otherwise. You will get many reports and many comments that come back to you thanking you for that role. You'll get some people who are unreasonable and very demanding, and you can look at Smart Traveller and see some of the things that people do demand. I remember one gentleman coming overseas wanting his welfare payments that he would normally collect in Australia paid to him through embassies as he travelled around on holidays internationally. I remember a lady who went overseas, and this is not uncommon. You travel overseas, you think you're in better health than you were in Australia, so you stop taking your medication, and all of a sudden that affects your behaviour and you get into trouble. And there are manuals, you do training, there's consular training before you go overseas, but there is such a diverse range of situations that you're going to face with that no training and no manual can prepare you for 100%. So there's a lot of common sense. You have to have empathy, and you certainly have to have a lot of patience. The better relationships that you can build with your host country, the more support you're going to get from them, both from the police, from the courts, from hospitals. And if you have those networks in there, you'll have greater access and you'll be able to provide better support to the people that you are helping in Australia. You get to travel to a lot of places. In my case, I've been to North Korea, I've been to Iran, I've been to Iraq. I have the Axis of Evil set. I've been to tens of other countries, and of course most cities in Australia, including Canberra, which I might put in the Axis of Evil as well itself. As you embark on this opportunity, I wish you well. Please make sure you do well in your studies. Think of the different ways that you can apply for the role, both formally through the graduate program and informally. I wish you well with your applications and good luck when you do become a diplomat overseas. Thank you.